rare books in Princeton. And he said he thinks it may even be older. He said it's definitely 1820s, from what I can see, based upon the cover. I'm sorry I have to keep it this bag, but it's so delicate. But he said, based upon what he said, it may go back to the 18th century. So if it belonged to my great-grandfather, then it may have belonged to his grandfather. We don't know. But this book was in use probably from at least the 1800s on. So I have some comments over here which I prepared. I already thank Mosho for doing an incredible job in helping to organize all this. It's nice to have all of you here. I only wish there were more opportunities we can meet under such pleasant circumstances. But this is a very special occasion because I had this beautiful prayer book, and it was sitting in my break front for so many years. And I thought it would be nice to share this with everybody so that all the generations, the people here, your children, your grandchildren, whoever, when they come to see the synagogue, it's such a beautiful historical place, they'll be able to see something about the Moses family. They'll have the photograph of our ancestors. They'll have this Bible here, which was in use maybe from at least 1800 on. And this is treasured. This is a precious legacy. So I prepared some comments over here. And it's interesting to note that this Bible was already old when the Moses family came to America. This Bible was old when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox in 1865. It was already there. But it's a living testament that we should never forget who we are, and I think as Mosho said, and where we come from, and to pass this heritage that we have along to the people behind us. To appreciate the Moses family history, you have to place it in the proper historical perspective. So let's go back 2,000 years ago, all right? Ancient Israel had fought and lost 3 wars with Imperial Rome. And when you lost the war with Rome, you were just decimated. They destroyed cities. They murdered people. They took the unhealthy people and they brought them back to Rome to be sold as slaves. The Third War ended in 70 AD, and it's written that something like 100,000 Jews perished in Jerusalem alone. The younger, healthy ones were put on ships to be taken back to Rome to be sold as slaves. But the survivors were taken on these ships, and one ship apparently landed on the Albanian coast where they were released. Why or how they're released, I don't know. That's lost to history. But they got their freedom when they got there. And eventually some of them wandered into a little town called Janina, and that's where our ancestors were from. Now, had they gone on to Rome, and I think it's important to know this, they would have been sold into slavery, or else they would have been forced to fight in the arena, or else they would have had to build the Colosseum, which was financed with Jewish money, which the Romans took from Israel after they defeated it in 70 AD. Actually, it was 68 AD. Masada fell in 70 AD. So it would have been built with Jewish slave labor and money. So if you ever go to Rome and you look at the Colosseum, think you may have some ancient ancestors who helped build that place. Jews were not new to Greece, however. I mean, a large number already existed in Athens for several hundred years. They're all over the Roman Empire. Between 70 AD and 430, the area that we now is known as Janina experienced endless wars with neighboring countries. On numerous occasions, Jews were driven out of Janina, but eventually they returned and new ones came. Despite the romantic view that we may have of Janina, the truth is it was never really a paradise for Jews. In some periods, they were left in peace and prospered and did well. In others, they were under pressure to convert and experienced persecutions. Compared to other areas in Europe, however, they probably were better off. Stability came in 1430 when the Ottoman Turks took over the city, and religious tolerance was granted to Christians and Jews, providing they paid heavy taxes. The Turks controlled the military and administration, while Christians and Jews ran the economy. Now, when I was there, as I remember, the Christians were heavily involved in the silver trades. They made beautiful kinds of silverware, which was sold all over Europe, and the Jews were involved in the garment business. I think Mordecai Moses, my grandfather, was involved in dyeing cloth, as I remember. But life in Janina, however, remained precarious. I mean, imagine a life where a Muslim could knock on your door and demand your 13-year-old daughter for the harem, and there was no choice in that. You just had to let your daughter go, or else. That's the way it was. The relationships between the three groups over the centuries was spotty. Sometimes they got along, other times they didn't. Janina remained an isolated community where Jews had minimal contact with other Jews. They weren't entirely cut off, it's just that in the culture and society they lived in, they didn't have the means to travel that well. In 1492, the Turks invited Spanish and Sicilian Jews, and that came as news to me. I didn't know they'd come from Sicily, to come to Greece, which resulted in 15,000 to 20,000 people going to Salonika and 30,000 to 40,000 going to Constantinople. So the influx of Sephardic Jews resulted in culture shock for both sides. Sephardic services were conducted a bit differently, and the Sephardics were seen as most brilliant Talmudic scholars, and also they were known to be very fine physicians. The Sephardics claimed that they were direct descendants of noble families from Jerusalem, and they kind of viewed Romaniats as maybe as quaint and provincial at the time. But eventually the two communities came to terms and they got along. In 1869, the Turks burned down the marketplace in Janina, leaving large numbers of Jews without a livelihood, and 850 were homeless. Many starved, they became sick and died. Then in 1872, on Greek Easter Sunday, Christians started a pogrom against Jews, but Turkish troops intervened to save them and restore order. In 1897, fighting broke out between Greece and Turkey again, creating chaos for everyone, and Jews, mostly poor, started to think about immigration. In the 1900s, life for the people of Janina worsened. The Greek determination to obtain freedom from Turkey intensified. 12 Jews were murdered by brigands, and even though the Turks eventually captured and executed them, the desire of Jews to emigrate intensified. This was made worse by food shortages, which people literally were starving. In 1904, 4,000 Jews in Janina were doing very poorly, and many had to leave. They simply had had enough. So large numbers emigrated to Bucharest, Alexandria, Istanbul, Palestine, or America. And affordable transportation to America became available, and many took it. In 1906, 1,000 Jews left for the United States, and in 1908, Mordecai left first with the three oldest, would have been Anna, Sophie, and Abraham, and Malcolm followed a year later with the youngest two, which would have been Rebecca, Malcolm's mother, and my father Joseph. My father told me that they stopped off in Corfu for an unknown period. I don't know much about that. After Corfu, they came to New York City. That part of the family history is not clear. My father, Joseph, told me that what motivated them to emigrate was that Mordecai had two sons, and he had three daughters, Sophie, Anna, and Rebecca. The problem was he didn't have dowries for them. In Greece, you needed a dowry for your girls. And apparently the girls, if your sons were older, they had to wait for the girls to be married off. That could be a problem if you didn't have a dowry. So, which means that if you came from a poor family, your daughters would have been married to much older men. Now, the girls, my dad told me, they raised hell over that. It had to be Aunt Sophie who did all the screaming. Because if you remember her, if you remember my Aunt Sophie, she was a tough cookie. But in America, Mordecai found husbands for her daughters, and whether he paid a dowry or not, I don't know, but he found three husbands for three girls. So that's the way it was. Mordecai made butcher aprons in his house. And my father was the salesman. He was like 12 or 13. He used to go down the street in the Lower East Side and sell his butcher aprons for a penny. And not a very glamorous business, but it put food on the Moses table. But now the story turns tragic. The Moses family now is out of Greece, but others remain. In 1940, Italy invades Greece, and
my daughter says to me, when you stop crying, you've lost your humanity, and I'm going to join you very soon. There's never enough tears for those that we lost.
well, anyways, Greece was under German control, and the country was divided into three military zones: German, Italian, and Bulgarian. At this point, there were 1,500 Jews left in Janina, and they weren't doing well. They were employed as laborers, storekeepers, or peddlers. But many of the older ones were supported by families in America. But as persecution against the Jews increased in Salonika, In Athens, the Jews of Janina believed that God would spare them because they were very observant people. Also, they paid very close attention to what the wealthy Jews and the rabbis told them. Whether they just seemed to follow them blindly. Now, while under Italian administration, they were safe, and I don't know why I'm having such a problem. But the Archbishop of Greece adamantly denounced persecution of Jews, and he defied the Nazis. He refused to cooperate in the roundup, and he demanded that Christians help save them, but it didn't work. July 1943, the SS Edelweiss Division arrived in Janina and took control. And the Nazi officer in charge, he kind of deceived the head of the Jewish community. I'm not sure if pronouncing his name right. It was Sabbatai Kabili. And he led them to think they were safe, but they were never safe. And Jewish leaders told the community to remain calm. If they had told them what was happening, a lot of them, probably the younger ones at least, would have escaped. But by March 1944, the persecutions began. And 2 Jews were executed. The Nazis assured the community that things would settle down as long as they were given money and supplies, which the Jews immediately provided. The young men who had joined the partisans were told to return immediately to prevent reprisals against the families, and most did so. You know, sometimes you hear, why didn't they fight back? But ask yourself this question. If you're 18 or 19 years old and your parents are in town and these monsters are standing over them with guns, what are you supposed to do if you're told that if you don't return home, your mother, your father, your sister, your brothers are all going to be slaughtered? And the Germans were serious. They meant business. That's exactly what they would have done. So these young boys left the partisans and they came home. On March 25th, Sibili was a very, very wealthy, influential member of the Jewish community there. He was warned that the Jews faced imminent arrest, but he didn't notify anybody. He kept it a secret, and perhaps if he'd warned some of them, many of them could have been saved. On March 25th, a freezing day, 1,850 Jews were rounded up. They were placed in trucks, and they were sent to Larissa, where they sat in a cold garage for 10 days, and whatever jewelry or valuables they had was turned over to the Nazis. I came across this photograph. Mosho tells me her name was Fanny Kind. And you can see how she's dressed in rags, and she's crying. And miraculously, she supplied the war. From the day they were arrested, rounded up until the day they were gassed at Auschwitz was 17 days. And she escaped. One of the Nazis involved in the transportation of Jews to Auschwitz was an Austrian officer called Kurt Waldheim. He brutally beat any Jew who did not do his bidding fast enough. And this monster later became Secretary General of the United Nations, and then he was elected President of Austria. He never served a day in jail. The Jews were put on trains and sent to Auschwitz, where the women and young children were immediately gassed. And as I mentioned, from the day they were rounded up to the death was 17 days. In 1850, of the 1,850 Jews who went to Auschwitz, only 181 survived. And the wife and daughter, one of them, Joseph Masius, is here today. And those who returned, they found their homes occupied by squatters, many of whom had collaborated with the Germans, and they were given their homes as a reward. It was difficult to get these homes back, and legal barriers were placed in the way. It took Rebecca Varon, Malcolm's mom, many years and a lot of money to regain possession of a house that grandfather Mordecai had bought there years before. I also met Vic Demasius, as I mentioned, his wife and daughter are here. He survived Auschwitz. He told me when I met him that he was the only one that 44 out of 45 members of the Masius families died in the camp. He's the only one who returned. And he never got his family house back. When he tried to emigrate, the Greek government, which was then in a civil war with the communists, they wouldn't let him leave until he had served in the army for 2 years, which he did, and then he was allowed to emigrate afterwards. Most of the survivors of the war, they went to Athens, Israel, or America. I don't know how many are left in Janina today. There's very few of them.
32.
32?
Where?
Well, when I was there was about 3 times that amount, but that was a long time ago. But now let's talk about modern times on a more pleasant note. Mordecai and Malcolm would be so proud of their ancestors, of all of you. We're a family of achievers. We are business people, musicians, artists, teachers, tailors, bakers, authors, photographers, publishers, investigators, lawyers, historians, doctors, playwrights, and more. So thank you, Mordecai and Malka. Everyone in this room has fulfilled your dream. Now, some of us have earned a place in history. You may not be aware of this, but it was a Moses descendant who was the astrologer who provided Nancy Reagan with advice on how to run the government and the world. And she passed this information to Ronald Reagan. Right? I forgot her name. But perhaps the greatest Moses family achievement, one that absolutely guarantees our place in history forever, is how Bessel Cohen, who was Sophie's husband, helped introduce pizza into New York City. I remember the store well. Man was a marketing genius. He placed the oven in the front of the store, and he had a big sign outside, 15 cents a slice. And the guy was in there flipping the dough up in the air and making pizzas right by the window. And people saw this thing. It looked so delicious. You had to go in and buy it for 15 cents. He was one of the geniuses who brought it in here. He was a man of vision. Now, we're also a family that's been tested. Sam Varon, as Malcolm's father, he worked for an anti-Semite. He had to hide his faith for many years to keep his job so he could support 8 people. And I'm sure other members of the family had the same. I had similar experience years ago. Now, some of us are war heroes. In World War I, my father Joseph, he was a teenager, he got into the Merchant Marine and nearly lost his life when 3 out of 7 munition ships he was on were torpedoed. They blew up and everybody drowned who survived the explosion. He came home to find that his mother had died while he was away. It took years for him to recover the sense of guilt that he experienced. Now, in World War II, Marco Cohen, who was Marty and Marilyn Kern's father, was taken out of a military hospital, and as sick as he was sent into battle in Pacific. I don't think he ever recovered from that. Max Moses, who's the father of Eleanor and Alan, stood on a warship watching a Japanese kamikaze come right at him, frightening. Francis Varon, who was Nelson and Malcolm's brother, fought at the Battle of the Bulge, and he told me all he had when the Germans broke through was a pistol he had bought from somebody. That's all he had to defend himself with. Rebecca Varon, again, Malcolm's mother, drove a Red Cross ambulance in New York City in World War II. And while she was doing this, she had to care for her husband, and she had 6 children, one of whom was handicapped. So now we come to the Moses family prayer book. As I mentioned, the son of my father said it belonged to his grandfather. And experts had told me it could go well beyond the 1820s. It may go back to the 18th century. So this book was in Yanina, going to services when some of these events were taking place, at least in 1908. And it was probably used in this very synagogue that it is. So it's your precious legacy. It was used in Yanina during the period of chaos and the programs that our ancestors had to endure. And it'll be on display forever, in this house of God, which our ancestors, Mordecai Moses, and I found out recently, Bessel Cohen helped build. So this little prayer book has come home. It's yours. Cherish it. So thank you all for coming. Now, maybe somebody would like to say something? Make any comments?
Can I can't help it, this is my, can I add a couple of footnotes?
Please do.
What you said. Slap me if I'm out of line. I've been doing extensive research on the immigration of Romano, Greek-speaking Jews to the United States. In fact, there's a book I'm writing that I'm hoping will be in publication in 2016. We have the funds, we have the publisher, I just got to get it finished. With the extensive work that I've done on immigration, one of the other aspects, you mentioned the dowry, that was so important. Antiquated inheritance system, which meant that everybody in the family inherited equally. It sounds fantastic. You've got 8, 9, 10, 11 children. How do your sons start out in life with this pittance that they're going to be getting? So you had, usually the males came first or they came with their families. One aspect that had never been touched upon before is the influence of what was happening in the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Now, where we led a relatively blessed existence under the Ottoman Turks, being forced to serve in the Ottoman Turkish army was something that forced many young men to leave. And if you look at the dates when they left, 25 was the magic year. You could get out of serving. You had to pay. But each year the price increased. So the first pioneer that came here from Yanina whose name was Zachariah Yomtov, came at the age of 25. It was not a coincidence. Now, also, Sicilian Jews.
Pardon?
Sicilian Jews.
Right.
They were under the house of Ferdinand and Isabella. So when the expulsion order came to expel the Jews of Spain, it also affected those Jews in the south of Italy, including Sicily. There were a whole group of Jews in Janina that had a separate Purim that was celebrated the saving of the Jews of Siracusa in Sicily. Upstairs in our museum, you can see a separate scroll for that Purim. Connections between Sephardic and the Roman Yotes. Geography, that mountain range, the Pindos mountain range. I mean, now they blasted through it, and you can go from Salonika to Janina in 3 hours on a modern highway. Back then, it could take days, sometimes weeks. You had to go over the mountains. So what that did is really keep the Roman Yote Greek-speaking Jews separate from the Sephardic Spanish-speaking Jews up until modern times. And then, of course, there's what Ray Dalvin said as far as their connection. She said, God save us from the Turks of Janina, the Christians of Arta, and the Jews of Salonika. So this shows the friction that was taking place between Sephardim and Roman Yote Jews. Even in modern times, they looked down upon the Roman Yote Jews. They called them Grecos, which was a derogatory term. The Sephardim had air. I can say this is my world. I know what they're like. They had their noses in the air. The same thing happened down here on the Lower East Side. We had 2 Sephardic synagogues around the corner. They looked down on us. The Ashkenazim didn't even think these Jews were Jewish. How could you be Jewish if you didn't speak Yiddish? You want to know something? The laugh is on them. They're all gone, and we're still here. So on that note, I will be quiet.
Anybody else like to make a comment or share a memory or whatever? No? Okay, so let's socialize.
Okay, you want to go upstairs?